Thank you. And moving back to our paper speakers this evening. Speaking second in proposition is Alys Denby. Alys is editor of CapX, a publication, of the Centre for Policy Studies. She has appeared on Politics Live, Cross Question, Talk TV and GBNews, and written for the Telegraph, the Eye, the New Statesman and the Critic. Alys, it's wonderful to have you here. You have the ears of the House.
Good evening. So I was actually at Conservative Party conference a few weeks ago, and even stranger and more out of touch with ordinary Britons than this current audience I stand before today. And I can tell you that every Conservative, from the most grizzled Rotarian to the most rubicund KUKA member, yearns for a return of Margaret Thatcher. She calls to them in some perverse way, and it's not just out of nostalgia. It's out of a longing, I think, to rediscover the clarity and purpose that she gave to the Conservative cause and which won them 3 successive elections. And that yearning, I think, explains why they chose Liz Truss as their leader. She was the sort of political equivalent of a drag act, all power dresses, Iron Lady rhetoric and a policy agenda that was a gross exaggeration of Thatcher. And underneath it all, nothing's quite as it seems. This analogy, unfortunately, does collapse when you consider that it was actually Margaret Thatcher who had balls. Liz Truss's premiership, you could say, is a sort of standing rebuke to this motion. You could say that Britain tried a new Thatcher. She was a disaster. But for me, the Truss experience demonstrates that there was far more to the Thatcher project than the caricature. If all she'd ever done was talk tough and cut taxes, she would never have won elections or succeeded in changing the country in the way she did. And I think, as Alex proves, you're talking about you're laying all our current travails at the feet of Thatcher, a woman who I think probably left office before you were born. I think this just shows the way in which, I'll make some progress, the way in which she changed the country, and we're still living with that legacy. So in arguing that Britain needs a new Thatcher, I'm not going to say we need to go back to the 80s. You're absolutely right. We are facing a completely different set of challenges to those she inherited in 1979. And however much some Conservatives may wish to take on the miners or send a task force to the Falklands, that's not going to solve our current problems. But there are 3 ways in which our current historical circumstances are similar and where I think we could learn from her example. First, as other speakers have mentioned, we have an economy gripped by high inflation, which is eroding living standards and causing industrial unrest. Second, we are living in a dangerous and uncertain world where democracies face enemies ideologically opposed to our way of life. And third, I would argue, as again other speakers have made this point, we are up at a political turning point where the status quo is no longer viable, and we need a leader with an ironclad determination to change course. Now, briefly on the economy, starting with inflation, you don't have to be Milton Friedman to recognise that printing loads of money might be a factor. Yes, go on. Yeah, if you let me continue, I'm going to get to that point. It has suited both the government and the Bank of England to blame factors outside of their control, like supply chain disruption and the war in Ukraine, rather than their own decision to inject almost $1 trillion into the economy via quantitative easing since the financial crash of 2008. Thatcher would never have pretended that that wasn't a political choice. Today, we have an opaque and unaccountable system, as you say, a Bank of England that's not elected, that prints money. We have a system of committees, forecasts and models, which nonetheless completely fail to see this inflation crisis coming. And again, the Liz Truss disaster proves why we so desperately need a return to sound money. She wanted to make completely unfunded tax cuts and increase borrowing to do so, and the world economy said no. So it's up to those who claim that there is a way for a country to live beyond its means to explain with as much clarity as Thatcher did when comparing the public finances to a household budget. Sorry, I will make some progress. Turning to foreign policy. It was a Soviet propagandist who gave her the sobriquet Iron Lady, of which she was immensely proud. And it stuck not just because it was so evocative of the Cold War era, but because of her strength on the world stage. And that strength came not just from her relentless defence of British interests, but also from her moral purpose. It's scarcely imaginable that a politician today could tell a journalist, as she did, that she was in politics because the conflict between good and evil, and out of the conviction that good will triumph. And I remember chairing a panel at another Conservative conference, apologies to this audience, with David Willits, who of course worked for her. And he explained it this way. He said that her free market ideology was underpinned by her Christian faith, and that these two, hand in hand, determined all her decisions. And whatever you think about that. For voters, it did mean that if you could recognise that intellectual framework, you would know how she would react in an unforeseen situation. And those who understood this, I'm sorry, we'll make some progress. Those who understood that knew that she was never going to respond in any other way to the invasion of the Falklands, for example. I would say that Russia, China and Iran represent an enemy blurrier in its outlines, more diffuse in its aims, but no less hostile to democracy than the Soviet Union or the Argentine junta. And whatever happens in the next few years, the British people deserve to know the basis on which decisions will be made in their name. And I fear that is simply not the case with our technocratic current Prime Minister or his likely successor, Keir Starmer, whose only motivating belief is getting himself elected. And finally, I'm sure in your seminars here, and I think this gentleman over here touched on this idea that it's fashionable to dismiss the great man or woman theory of history and to downplay the significance of Thatcher herself as an individual. And I agree with Alex that many of the changes that occurred during her tenure were inevitable. I mean, does anyone seriously think that coal mining would still be a major industry in net zero Britain today, or that the government would still have a stake in many nationalised industries like British sugar, for example, if it weren't for her? It's also true, as I think other speakers have touched on, that she was a lot less radical than is commonly perceived. I mean, the fact that she kept wets like Jim Pryor or Lord Carrington in her cabinet, I think shows that she was a pragmatist. But as Emma over here said, she did represent a significant break from the post-war consensus that had preceded it. And this wasn't just a political project for her, but an intellectual one, which found its roots in, of course, the Chicago School and also here at Cambridge with the Peterhouse Right. And with the foundation of the Centre for Policy Studies, she created an infrastructure through which new ideas could feed into government, which still exists today, and of course in which I declare an interest. What do you want to say about my employer?
Not the employer, just the general ideas. Do you think that the mantra of there is no such thing as society, that kind of hyper-individualism is really suitable for today's world when we're
misunderstood?
I don't think that's what I'm arguing at all. And if you let me finish, I'm absolutely not saying that we need to completely recreate her ideas or go back to the 80s. I think there are qualities that she had which might be useful to us today. And one of them is having a politics based on ideas rather than on expediency. And let me continue. So, yes, you may object to a kind of politics that's based on idea, and a criticism that's often levelled at it is that it was divisive. But I would say that we are already divided as a nation, and not just between North and South or Brexit or Remain, but crucially, as many of other speakers have touched on, between the young and the old. I'm talking to a young audience here, and let me ask, how many of you believe that you'll be able to buy your own home one day? How many of you think you'll be able to retire at 65? As other speakers have said, we are living in a gerontocracy where spending on over 65s is projected to increase by 11% of GDP by the 2070s, which is going to be over 250 billion a year. Debt is going to be nearly 300% of GDP in 50 years if spending on health, pensions and social care continues on its current trajectory. You are going to spend your working lives paying ever more tax to pay for the pensions and healthcare of older generations that never had to make those same sacrifices. These are not the results of active policy decisions, but of sleepwalking onto a completely unsustainable path. The consensus has failed. We need to change course, and we need a leader who is prepared to take on vested interest, who doesn't just pander to certain cohorts of people who tend to vote, but is interested in winning a battle of ideas. Now, my instinct, I expect many of you will disagree, but my instinct may be that these qualities are most likely to be found in a leader from the right, but I don't think it has to be that way. Both sides of the spectrum would benefit, to your point, from having politicians with a clear framework of ideas, the ability to articulate them, who had the courage to respond to events out of conviction rather than the expediency of the news cycle, and who refused to countenance British decline. And I think it was a Marxist historian who put it best. It was Raphael Samuel who wrote, after she was ousted from her own party in the 90s, that Thatcher stumbled on issue after issue of high principle where there were genuinely incompatible moral choices to be made, thereby forcing the left into defining its own position. I, for one, he said, regret that there is no longer anyone to keep us on our ideological toes. So whether you're left or right, Britain needs a new Thatcher, and I commend this motion to the House.